So, hello, I would like to welcome you to our 39th PoSoCoMeS seminar. Today we are talking about the book from Peter Vermeersch, Pulse, The Power of Song and the Belarusian Struggle for Freedom. The title in Dutch is Polsslag. The book was published in 2025, and today we have the author, Peter Vermeersch, who is a writer and political scientist and at the University in Leuven, focusing on democracy movements in Eastern Europe. He has written essays to New Writing and McSweeney's, and his book have been published in Dutch. With experience in cities like Warsaw, Prague, and Sarajevo, he co-founded the Forum of Central and Eastern Europe and works with organizations like PEN Flanders, and he lives in Brussels. I hope everything is correct.
It is. Thank you.
Thank you. Our discussant is Dr. Katarzyna Loska. He's a joint research fellow at the Egmont Institute at the European Policy Center and research associate at the University Leuven. Previously, she was a research fellow at the University of Oxford Belarus Observatory, the German Marshall Fund to the US, and a visiting researcher at the University of Vienna and the University of Tartu. Katarzyna's research on Belarus and Ukraine was published, among others, in the Journal of International Relations and Development, European Security, and the Journal of Slavic Military Studies. And the book Pulse tells us the story how music fights dictatorship. In 2020, Belarusians protested Lukashenko's regime singing Peremen, the change, a Soviet rock anthem burned protest hymn. When the band Irdorat was jailed for playing it, the struggle became part of a bigger movement. And even in exile, the artists keep resisting through their work, using music and culture to challenge oppression and keep hope alive. And the book tells us the story about how art doesn't just reflect politics, it's about how it shapes it. So, Peter, the floor is yours. We are looking for the presentation of the book.
Yeah, thank you, Alina, and thank you so much for having me on this event. It's really a pleasure to talk about some of the work that I've been doing on Belarus. And Belarus is an interesting place, I think, that often gets forgotten in between all of the other stuff that is happening in the world and in Central and Eastern Europe. But I think it's an important case to keep reminding people how crucial it is to look at what happens with the authoritarianism in Belarus, how it sits within the broader spectrum of politics in the region, but also how citizens cope with it, how they respond to the authoritarianism there. And in my work and in the book in particular, I try to trace the evolution of music and art as a catalyst and a carrier of pro-democracy movements and activism in the region, but particularly in Belarus. And I'm focusing, like you said, Alina, in the introduction, specifically on music and bringing into memory the role of music, roughly since the summer of 2020. Obviously, it's a bigger history, but I'm focusing on this, let's say, these last couple of years, this recent couple of years, because I think it's a really important case study of how art survives under extreme authoritarianism in a context of very detrimental geopolitics as well. And art survives not only, it keeps the hope for change alive. And I think as a result of that, we need to start focusing. I think also it's a call towards academic on this role that art can play and citizens can play in combination with art in authoritarian regimes, and how authoritarian regimes, on the other hand, very often use or see artists as a prime target, which they focus on in their oppression. So in this seminar here, I just want to highlight a couple of things that I find intriguing, important about the Belarus case as a case study of this broader phenomenon. And from there on, from these highlights that I focus also and stories I think I focus on in the book as well, we can start a conversation which can go in different directions. And I know that Katja will take it into certain directions, and I'm looking forward to those questions and directions already now. And obviously, I mean, for everyone who is listening in, there will be other examples coming up that I think are worth comparing or contrasting with the case of Belarus. And I would really invite people to think about their own cases that they're interested in and try to contrast or compare it with Belarus, because that's also a way of keeping the memory of the Belarus case alive and validating the activism that has been happening there. So Belarus, it's a key country in the region. I think a key country to understand crucial developments in Eastern Europe, like I said, in these recent times. And I want to say a few things more general about it, about the history. It's an authoritarian regime, as I think everyone here in the virtual room knows. But it's also, I think, an important case to understand a number of other countries in the region. It's on the border between East and West, meaning it is a good vantage point to try to understand how regional power is distributed, how Russia acts towards the post-Soviet Union or the post-Soviet space, how resistance is still possible in this very complex situation. It's also, I think, a lens to try to understand what's happening with regard to the war in Ukraine. And it's all complicated and interesting, I think, to see it from that particular vantage point of Belarus. Belarus has been governed since the early 90s, since 1994, by Alexander Lukashenko, the dictator, authoritarian leader of the place, whose administration is marked by systematic suppression of dissent. And it has an extensive and expansive security apparatus. Now, what is striking with regard to the authoritarian regime in Belarus, in that it's often in political science regarded, and in media, I think in general, regarded as a sort of a remnant of the past. It's like the old Soviet power still sort of stumbling along in current times, but it's seen like a dinosaur of previous times. Now, I think if we look at the last few years, I think the views of that have changed a bit. And instead of dismissing it as something which would end eventually, as all authoritarian dictators from the past would end eventually, you could also look at it today as a forerunner of some of the authoritarian tendencies we see elsewhere in the world, and also as a prime example of how political opportunism functions in oppressive systems, how a dictator can exploit some of the regional and geopolitical contexts around it, and how the security machinery is deployed to keep citizens from reaching what they actually want, and that is a more democratic and more fair state. So there's a lot to learn from the current moment and from seeing Belarus as not as a remnant of the past, but very much in the current times. The elections of 2020 are like a pivotal moment, obviously, and people in the virtual room will remember this. This was such a crucial time when there was a nationwide protest. There had been protests in the past in Belarus against the regime of Lukashenko, but this was the first time that actually it really, that many people thought, well, it would make a huge difference. What triggered it was obviously the falsified elections of the summer of 2020 and the police protests, the police violence that happens after that, when people start protesting the outcome of the election and the falsifications of it. It's always said that Lukashenko somehow had a social contract with the citizens of Belarus, that they would accept some lesser freedom, let's say, in return for stability and safety and care from the state. But it was really that this illusion was really dismantled in the summer of 2020, and there were really strong opposition candidates, opposition forces at the forefront of the protests against these, the election results and the regime in general. We can go into that a little bit later on and more in detail if you want, but this is, I will assume, a bit of a known story. What is perhaps less known is that during the months of protests following the 2020 elections, that there were lots of artists and creative people active in the protest movement, people who previously would have not been mobilized so much to care about politics. Suddenly they were on the streets, they were supporting and galvanizing and giving power to this bottom-up demand for change. And singing was a very important part of it. It's a collective enterprise, obviously, singing in group. It gives you power. It's low cost. It's a high impact medium too, because you can reach a lot of people in a short time, and you reach across different demographics. So you have something which is crucial in any social movement formation, the ability to link audiences and to find alliances. And here we come to the song that you mentioned, Aline. So there were many songs in the protests of 2020, and there had been many songs in Belarus as part of the movement before too. Many Belarusian songs, so that's an important element too. Belarusian as a language is obviously also the language of opposition and the language of freedom from dictatorship, and so there were several Belarusian pop songs that spoke to larger populations in the country. I just mentioned here Javan Volsky's very famous song Tri Charapachy. That surfaced and highlighted the protest. But in my book, I also focused on one particular song that intrigued me very much, and that's a song you mentioned. It's a Russian song, not a Belarusian song, called Перемен, meaning changes. We want changes is the refrain of that song. And it's actually a song from a previous era. It's a song from the 1980s, and it's a Soviet pop song that has its origins not in Belarus, but in Russia. At the time, it was Leningrad. Sorry, I see that some people have connection problems. Do I see that correctly? No? Okay.
I can hear you. I can see you. Yes.
Okay, good. Sorry. So I saw something popping up on the screen. Sorry for that. 1980s song suddenly becoming a pivotal song in Minsk in 2020. It's quite intriguing, isn't it? Because it's a Russian song that suddenly is becoming the song of a protest against a dictator in Belarus. So why did this particular song resonate so powerfully? There are many reasons. One thing, it's a very well-known song. It's general. It has, some resonance across generations. So I think that younger generations got to know it, but older generations already knew it. But also events, of course. It was catapulted into popularity as a regard of a viral video in the summer of 2020, when two DJs played it in a government event as a form of protest. And so subsequently, it became part of a much more larger movement of defiance. And the word Peremien started to pop up in different parts of Belarus as a sign, a new sign, let's say, of an old song, but a new sign of political opposition. At some point, there was a square of change, so named after the song. Some arrests happened in relation to that song, and so on. Many stories piled up onto this one song. Now, I was further intrigued by something which happened a year later, almost a year later, and that is, I think, interesting for memory scholars. The original band from the 1980s had a reunion tour, and in that same year, starting from Russia. but they planned to go to all of the post-Soviet areas, so all the countries that were formerly part of the Soviet Union. And so in early 2021, so after months of protests in Belarus had happened and people have been exiled, and it was clear that there was a big crackdown in Belarus, the surviving members of the Kino band, and I should say the surviving members because the lead singer had died quite long ago, already in the early 1990s, but the surviving band members, they had a reunion tour and they visited and sang the song in Minsk. So somehow they had gotten permission from the government to do that, or they were allowed to do that. And I think this is an intriguing sort of little twist to that particular protest song, because somehow it shows, I think, the paradoxical selectivity of authoritarian censorship. So there's an occasional tolerance for protest song when it's a high profile performance coming from Russia, and it can be somehow, tolerated by the regime. But at the same time, ordinary people are still arrested for singing that same song. And in the book, I have this focus on one band that participated in the protests, a Belarusian folklore folk band, folk rock band, called Irdarat, and they rendered the song Peremien during the summer of 2020 on bagpipes, quite a fascinating cover version. And they were arrested for it, and they served eventually 2 years of labor camp sentence for political instigation, or whatever the exact accusation was. So it's a complicated story, and there are many more nuances to it, but essentially what we see here is that a regime picks and chooses randomly elements of culture to focus on, and to give that as an example, show that as an example of oppression to the other parts of the population, while at the same time not showing that it's not maintaining some sort of overall logical, seemingly structure to it, creating quite a bit of anxiety among the population of what is allowed and what is not allowed, urging populations who want to protest or not to protest anymore on the one hand, but also giving quite a bit of a challenge to protesting populations to be creative and to somehow they have to be very courageous to still want to risk something in the public sphere. And so the creation of anxiety is actually one of the main purposes here, I think. And it was also a sign that artists, I think the arrest of singers like that, of bands like that, it was really a sign that artists would continue to face severe repression. So it's signaling from the top down that this would happen. And in the book, I've talked, I represent some interviews and stories and conversations that I have had with some of these artists, including the people who sang the Peremien song and were in 2-year labor camps, 2 years in prison, basically, for that. And what happens is that what we see in Belarus is that even until today, there are lots of political prisoners. And some of them have been released because they were at the end of the sentence. Some of them have been released more recently. Some high-profile political prisoners have been released as part of a deal with, let's say, international forces, in particular the US, as a result of the diplomatic efforts. But interviewing these people gives you a bit of a realistic view of what actually happens there, because people are in terrible conditions in prison. Not only are they detained for reasons that is clearly a human rights violation, but also within the prison itself, as prisoners, let's say, they face conditions that would not be acceptable in any country that would claim to uphold human rights standards. And when you see that they are freed, when they are freed, it is often presented as sort of a diplomatic, let's say, compromise as a sort of regime that shows its soft side. But it's not so soft at all, because the people are immediately forced out of the country, as has happened with the band members that I interviewed, who were in prison for 2 years and then basically were forced to flee the country and live their lives, continue their lives elsewhere, not in the country anymore. And we've seen that with the recent releases of other high-profile political prisoners as well, human rights activists, the presidential candidate Tikhanovsky, the presidential support person Maria Kalashnikova. They have been released recently, but they are not free in a sense, because they have been pushed out. They had to leave the country. So in the book, the second part of the book is also kind of a meditation, let's say, on what it means to be faced with an authoritarian regime that excels in such expulsions and actually forces people not only inside into some form of slavery, you could say, of the state, but actually forces people out of the country when they have a dissenting opinion or when they are politically active. And in the diaspora communities that then come to life, then again, art and music is a very important element there. It's something that keeps the hope for change alive. And that too, I think, is worth our attention and worth our study, because you can see that in terms of music, for example, you see that Belarusians abroad create and maintain these musical traditions and performances as a sort of sonic bridge, you could say, to across borders to the home scene, where they have often family members and friends still there. And I think it works hand in hand, this artistic production. It works hand in hand with human rights activism or political opposition abroad. Organizations that keep personal correspondence alive with detained people who are political prisoners, among them artists. They work with the artists abroad to raise the awareness about the situation of these political prisoners in Belarus. And so even when musicians are domestically silenced, they can still sustain some sort of international movement for change, for political opposition through their art production, through music, and through keeping the narrative about change alive. Since you're all memory scholars, I've also need to highlight a little bit in the book how the case of Belarus stands also in a larger tradition of music and art as undergirding political movements against oppression, and as crucial part of a repertoire of action for change. And Eastern Europe is really full of that. If you look at the history of Eastern Europe in the 20th century, you see that similar dynamics of artists being involved in opposition movements is very tangible and very present there. And we tend, I think, to think, from the cliche of political scientists, tend to think about, literary dissidents and about dissenters in the intellectual sphere. But I think I wanted to show in the book that it's also in the popular culture very often, and that you find rock musicians and popular musicians during previous times being very part of the movement for more democracy and against authoritarianism. I've talked about the Velvet Revolution and also the 1960s in Czechoslovakia as a precursor for the changes at the end of the 1980s in the book. I talk a little bit about Poland and the Solidarity movement and how a couple of songs there functioned really as cementing the energy of the movement. There's this one song by Jacek Kaczmarski called Mure, which was also then in the Belarusian oppositional movement, a very important song. It was translated into Belarusian and then sang across the movement there. But it's originally, it's very fascinating history. It's a Catalan protest, Catalan song. So it's originally originates in Spain. And then the Peremien song was in Russia also used during political protests in an earlier time during the 2011-2012 protests against Putin. Peremien surfaced there, also linking Russian, opposition forces. Unfortunately, didn't result in any important changes in the Kremlin, but at least it was there as an important aspect of it. So I think these are some things to think about when you look at the Belarusian case. I focused really in the book a lot of the importance of music and as a not only a symbolic source and a source of energy, but really as something which brings people together, really literally and materially into a protest movement. And I think it's worth to keep that memory of such intangible things, but important forces as music alive in the study of those movements, because it can amplify political demands also in the future and sustain I think the morale and the inspiration and the creativity for future political opposition, and to keep the movement, let's say now, coherent and alive in diaspora. So I think there's a lot to study there. There's a lot to point attention to, it's part of my book is a call to people, journalists, but also other scholars and students, to keep that memory alive and to pay attention to it, to validate, I would say, the hope that emerges from the collective singing. And this is important in our current times, very much elsewhere in the world, to make the circle round and come back to where I started in my talk here. Belarus is one case of where an authoritarian regime has taken very forcefully hold, and where it's sometimes very hard to see any hope. But it's important to study as scholars the hope that there is and not dismiss it. We shouldn't only study the mechanisms of authoritarian repression. We should also study and support the ways that people fight it at home or in diaspora networks. And we should study the means of and the sources of inspiration that are part of it, like art and music. They are integrative to such a movement. And I think in political science study, we should take this culture seriously and keep it on board. So in sum, Belarus, I think since 2020 in particular, has been a crucial case for so many things that are relevant for us today. And the case reminds us that even under the most repressive conditions, something like a simple melody can carry the weight of a people's hope and preserve its memory and galvanize international solidarity. And that's what we should work towards. And therefore, I'm, very keen to keep that conversation on Belarus going.
Thank you very much, Katarina. The floor is yours.
Yes. Thank you so much, and many thanks for organizing the seminar, for inviting me. It's my big pleasure to have the opportunity to listen to Peter's presentation, but also to be able to discuss his book that I'm a big fan of. Due to my Dutch level, I read it not in one, but in two sittings, but I have to say that I truly enjoyed it because it also has this it builds on a really rich empirical material, and it does have this capacity to bring you back in time a bit. In the beginning, there is, I think it's a reference to maybe from one of the interviews that someone called Minsk, Rio de Janeiro, right? So if you read this book, you sort of, you do understand the Rio de Janeiro version of Minsk, which of course was not a happy carnival, right? But yet it just, I think it's an incredible, also in a way, archival document for the future, what is there in this book, and I really like it. I want to make sort of 3 broader reflections on what has been said, but also on the book, and then ask a couple of questions. And my first sort of broader reflection, and it's a bit zooming out, but I think this whole discussion on music, protest, and opposition is fascinating, because I think also this book and what Peter has been talking about shows how political activities under authoritarian regimes operate, but it goes much beyond those binaries that we are used to, that there is regime on the one hand and there is sort of organized political opposition on the other hand, and this is the levels that we discuss, right? So I think that it's precisely this authoritarian regime or context that gives you the opportunity in a way, right? And like not a good context, but it gives you the opportunity to look at these forms of political participation, which usually I would say even invisible if we study democratic context, right? Because if we study politics in a democratic context, we usually look at elections, at political parties, at, I don't know, role of trade unions. And these are all the organizations, processes, and actors which are not available in the context like Belarus, right? In a highly repressive regime. And this politics finds its place elsewhere, right? Before it was always a bit like a joke that people are afraid to talk about politics and they do it in the kitchen. But if it happens in the kitchen, then we need to go to this kitchen, right? And to study it. And this is a bit, I feel, the research-wise, a very interesting case to study, right? Because this is in a way this relatively safe space, culture, also some private domains, other domains where people feel freer a bit, right, to express themselves, to have debate. It's a space of political agency, and this is what I think is so valuable and important about the book that we are talking about today. I know that a few years ago, after the when I was already here, one of my friends also asked me a question, but Katya, how do you know that the elections were lost, right? That Lukashenko did not win the elections? And I said to her, we have this anecdote that has been very popular, that a man is walking home from work, and then the police stops and they start beating him, saying that they just start beating him randomly, and he says, "Guys, stop beating me, I voted for Lukashenko." And he said, and the police replies that no one voted for Lukashenko, and they put him in the truck, and this goes on. And then yeah, of course we cannot base it on the anecdote, right? And there are also some more tangible evidence, right? There was an online platform, Hola's Voice, and there were other tools that help to sort of say that even if the opposition, we don't know, did not win, that Lukashenko did not win those elections, right? There is sort of tangible evidence to that. There were a lot of falsified documents that became public, and so there is evidence. But I think this kind of, why I mentioned the anecdote, that a lot of the times these private jokes and memes and stories, they become the spaces of political contestation where you can see what you cannot see if you look just at these rigid political processes, right? And this is what I think this book really does in an incredible way. The second reflection that I had, and I was also thinking, like, why music, right? And also Peter said that a lot of musicians were indeed extremely active. And I think up until now, a lot of people, whatever events happen, especially with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, people are extremely vocal and engaged, right? And also even in Minsk in 2022, we had Belarusian singer Miriam Gerasimenko, right, who started to sing a Ukrainian band song in Minsk, in the center of Minsk in 2022, and was detained for that. But I think also music allows to maybe see deeper roots of this political contestation, because in the publications, and I think in some kind of this, in analysis, a lot of the times 2020 protests were discussed as some sort of surprise, as if nothing was happening before that, right? And I think it is very important that also when, we hear this Pyramid or some other, or these songs Muri, right, which have also historical connotation, it does say more about Belarus, right? Because I think this image of Belarus sometimes is a little bit too rigid, because even during the Soviet times, right, there were this homogenizing music that I think a lot of Soviet-born, raised people know, but there were also a lot of music that referred to some national images and symbols. And this was the case for Belarus too, like some band, Shabry, Pesnyary, this also existed, but this is somehow less noticed. And I think music and the study of it makes this kind of homogeneous image less homogeneous, right? The last point, and then I go to some questions, because my question actually is related to that a little bit, is this reflection on the role of music as a tool for exploring personal and national identity. What does it mean to be Belarusian? What does it mean? What is Belarus? How to articulate identity? In which language? And I wanted maybe to ask here, Peter, because I know you visited Belarus in the past, right? And I think while writing the book, you also discovered a lot. And, you know, if we read the literature, a lot of the times Belarus is presented as sort of, on the one hand, there is this like Soviet Belarus, and on the other hand, there is this opposition Belarus. But there is a lot more Belarusis than that, right? And I think music, in a way, does this job of showing other images of Belarus, right? Because there are also some bands that, I don't know, refer to the Grand Duchy of Lithuania music and vibes, like Stary Olsa and that. And I was just wondering, in your journey of writing this book, what kind of images of Belarus, expected or unexpected, did you discover, and what was the most maybe surprising image that you came across?
All right, thank you for that question, and thank you for all these reflections. I think, yeah, these are all very important. What is politics is a very important question, isn't it? I mean, if you open the news, it will only be about power politicians, political parties, maybe trade unions, maybe some political protest, but it's never going to be about what happens in the kitchen, what happens among people who are debating something in the park or something, you know, when they're concerned about their own kids, the future of their kids. Will they have a job? Will they have to go to the army? And so on and so forth. And I think it's so important that we include this perspective into our understanding of politics, especially when we're striving for democratic politics, because that's where democratic politics happens. It doesn't happen only in political parties and in elections. In fact, elections are very often the enemy of that sort of democracy. They very often are a tool for authoritarians to use and to manipulate, to get power. And so, yeah, the space of political agency, as you put it, is far beyond these classical institutions of political participation that we know, and should be the focus of our study, especially when we are studying democratic states or states that, or populations that aspire for democracy. It's so important. And then Belarus. Well, Belarus is such a surprising place, isn't it? I mean, there's no one Belarus, and the picture that you get from the outside is a picture that you maybe will see when you visit Minsk on the surface, like clean buildings and streets that have been you know, kept in order to give the illusion that people are living in an orderly state. And in a way, the state is orderly, you could say, because it's really top down and everything. So that image of Belarus is well known and will strike everyone who visits it and thinks about it. But then the other versions of Belarus are so exciting and much lesser known. And this is, for example, one of the things that I learned through another art form, photography. So there are interesting people in Belarus, photographers that I find like they create fantastic art about, you know, everyday life in Belarus and the sad side of it, but also like the hidden side of it, let's say. People exploring the new identities, exploring their freedom within the realm of the private space. The cover that I used in my book is it's a German photographer, but who her name is Julia Outz, and she went to Belarus and photographed young people in their private homes, in their rooms, where they experiment with gender identities, where they experiment with art making, music making, and it's such a creative sphere, and you can see it in these photographs. So that's one thing I was really charmed by and intrigued by. Let's say a version of Belarus as a creative space. Let's call it that way. And the second one that I think maybe some people have on their radar, but not everyone, that is the level of digital savviness that was really very important already before 2020. Lots of people who are working in the digital sector, and then young people mostly, I suppose, but maybe it crosses generations in a way that I don't know. I haven't done studies on it specifically, but I do know that knowing about, living in a state that monopolizes basically huge sections of the economy, but actually these are parts of the economy. They're powerful, but they're very old-fashioned in a way, you could say. But it leaves large swaths of economic activity untouched. And I think the digital sphere was at some point for a lot of Belarusian young people an area where they could start innovate and find their own way, even, if only for entertainment reasons, but at least, it became later on quite important also in the protest movement, as all kinds of connections could be made among people who were opposing the regime, and the chat channels that were part on Telegram also are a result of that during the 2020 protest. And the third, I think, image that I would like to highlight here of Belarus that we maybe don't know enough about is actually going back to the 2020 protests, and specifically the protests that, or the techniques and the creativity that involved monitoring the elections. So I think it's an example for many other countries, and many other countries will look at the Belarusian examples, I think, of people, and these are small technological inventions sometimes, people folding their ballot in a certain way, signaling to others then when you have voted against Lukashenko, and then the ballot box is transparent, so you can see actually that when the result comes in and it doesn't match what you actually saw in the ballot box, papers folded in a particular way, you could really sense that there was something wrong. The way the Holos platform worked, actually, that they tried to estimate the real number of votes for Tikhanovskaya back in then. That is highly creative electoral monitoring work in a world where the official electoral monitoring is not functioning anymore because the state somehow monitors the monitors. But then to invent ways of circumventing that is quite impressive, and I think Belarus really played a key role in doing that. Same thing for the, I can go on for ages, but another element, maybe just simply just pin it a little bit and not go too deeply into it, but the severe stamina of keeping the resistance alive against all odds and against a lot of forgetting and against a lot of ignorance in the rest of the world is also an image of Belarus, I think, that needs to be highlighted and brought for and studied. I think it's quite remarkable.
No, I absolutely agree with you, and I think it's also once we also discussed with you a bit earlier the role of musicians as such, right? And what kind of who they are, and I think the role they play. Sometimes they're public intellectuals, sometimes they're I don't know, political scientists, right? Because people want from them to have answers to some difficult questions. Sometimes they're psychologists and so on, right? So I think it's also fascinating to see how a creative individual is seen by the population, because we also know when people attend concerts and so on, usually these are some very small scale events, right? And then people often have these questions, burning questions that they need answers to, and this is oftentimes a musician or a poet, right, or a writer who has to confront questions like, is it better to have parliamentary or presidential republic, right? And this is a bit the role that musicians also have to play, and that is, I think, extremely interesting to see, because they do become part of the political discussion, right, and engage in it, and a lot. But on this,
exactly, and so I have many examples, a couple of examples in the book as well. Talk about that a musician, suddenly, loses his or her audience because, is exiled and so on, and suddenly finds him or herself in some other town with a very small Belarusian audience, and then, the connection between the artist performing and the audience becomes very different, and then people start asking questions and answers coming from the musician who also doesn't know the answer. So it's fascinating stuff to be part of.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what is also very interesting, and what I want also to touch upon a little bit, is this the way how maybe music, what I already mentioned, becomes a tool for exploring this national identity. And sometimes it happens in very unexpected ways, right? Because the Belarusian society is very complex, and all the different markers, your language, your, I don't know, religion, all of this, it does not always match the political views, right? So you can be very pro-independence and against the regime, and speak Russian, right? And you can be Belarusian speaking, and so it's all very complex. And I think musicians and the role that they play also reflects it a bit. And I wanted to ask you how you see also the role of language here, because oftentimes a lot of this music comes in the Russian language, but and that's also a bit an extra question to that. What I'm very interested in, because I'm a scholar of Belarus, but also from Belarus, from a very specific region on the border with Ukraine, with such a heavy dialect that some people from Minsk cannot even understand it. I was wondering, how do you see also that not only Belarusian Russian, but there are also musicians who add this, it's called trashanka, right? It's like, I don't know, it's shaking language. It's a mix of everything, Russian, Polish, Belarusian. It's such a mix. How do you see that? Because also some musicians use that too, or drop some dialect words, and I find it extremely interesting, right? What's the role of language? And
so what happens in a state is usually the state wants to unify sort of standard language in order to communicate with all its citizens. That's benign and not a problem. But when it's an authoritarian state, obviously that language gets somehow hijacked. That standardized language gets hijacked by the regime then. And using other types of languages or playing with that language is basically questioning and interrogating the regime, criticizing the regime without actually having to say something critical necessarily. Also, it is a reflection of how people speak in reality, in daily, in the regions, in villages, outside of the capital. So it's also giving form to a demos, if you will, to a population, to a nation outside of the political sphere, and giving some idea of how people talk and how they communicate among each other. And this all gets reflected, that gets a space in that sort of creative art that uses and plays with it. So it's a democratic act, and it's politics without being politics. It's a democratic act because it includes many voices. It tries to give a voice to those who don't have a voice. And it's critical of politics without necessarily having to take a standpoint literally in your lyrics about the regime or about anything. But also, to add a little bit to that, perhaps, it's a fascinating area because it can shift. The regime can change its language policies and then try to reclaim some versions of the folk language and elevate it to the level of official support language for the regime and so on. So it's a dynamic going on between those who challenge it and then the regime who tries to reclaim it for its own purpose. And I think that's what we are seeing in Belarus quite a bit. And you can compare it to other countries as well. I mean, I know that, for example, language, I'm very sensitive to issues of language because of the Belgian situation too. In Belgium, it's a multilingual country. Language has often been mobilized by politicians for a certain political project, for Flemish independence. Some nationalists from Flanders are using language emancipation for that purpose, so there's a lot. There's a different story. I won't go into that too much because it's complicated, but it signals how language and politics are often in intricate ways interconnected, and I see a lot of those dynamics in Belarus too, and they deserve also further study, and because they are not known well enough, and people have very cliche views of language use in Belarus, and like you said, it's not black and white. You can be an opponent to Lukashenko and speak perfect Russian, or you can speak some local version of Belarusian and still be a supporter of Lukashenko. But often it's the case, of course, that now the Belarusian language serves as a vehicle for political protest against Lukashenko. And we see also that the regime cracks down on people who want to promote Belarusian literature, meaning literature in the Belarusian language, for example. So there's a lot of that going on too.
Absolutely, and that's also, I think, super interesting what you said about regime reclaiming also the Belarusian language, right? Because sometimes if you hear the speeches or listen to the speeches, you also see how Belarusian is used, or Belarusian words are dropped in a derogatory way. For example, describing people who left as Zmahary fighters, but using the Belarusian word. Or, for example, if there is an intention to reconnect with the West, how many more Belarusian language posts we see on social media, right? Which maybe escapes the eye of those who just read the translation, but it does happen, right? And this is, I think, also very interesting to, in terms of language politics, to see.
Absolutely.
I also have a bit provocative question what I was thinking about, because you was also talking when I asked you about different images and Belarus as this digital space, right, which also creates maybe opportunities to still be in contact with people who are in Belarus, who are there. But yet I think we have to acknowledge that it will be 6 years. It disappeared.
Okay, that's what I meant. Yes.
And that's happened.
I hope.
Let him give a chance to come back to us.
Yeah. If it happens the third time, it will be a transition.
Yeah, Katerina, in another case, you will tell us more about the book.
That's exactly what happened like 2 weeks ago. I was happy that it was not that session. I was on another seminar I was hosting. It was not our seminar, so it was not PoSoCoMeS, it was a different one. But this is the same problem we had. That Peter is there again. Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry, you asked a provocative question and I suddenly
it was too provocative. You decided to. No, just that we are in 2026, right? And it will be 6 years, and a lot has changed, I think, not only since the protest, but especially with the escalation of Russia's war on Ukraine, which made the prospects of Belarus even more complicated, I guess. And in this sense, there is a lot of creativity indeed on the side of Belarusians. There is a lot of resistance, and still there is a lot happening inside the country, but yet a lot of people are in jail, a lot of people, hundreds of thousands, had to leave. A lot of these creative instruments and music that is out there now, it's consumed mostly by people in exile, right? And even if it reaches people inside Belarus, a lot of of Telegram channels, a lot of YouTube channels are considered extremist, terrorist, and this of course makes people people are scared, right, to have access to this content. And I was just wondering, with this all the kind of cultural outburst, maybe let's put it like this, that has been happening in the past years, I think indeed art gives you some kind of portable homeland that you can have it with you even if you're abroad and feel Belarusian, right? But do you think we will have, you know, I was talking about two Belaruses as one Soviet, one opposition. We will have Belarus inside Belarus and Belarus in exile. And do you see that music can play a role in bridging these two when, again, I don't know how much time is still ahead of us before some change happens, that people, for example, can start going back home without being afraid of it?
Yeah. So basically, your question is about predicting the future, right? And it's always an impossible question, of course. But I do see the danger that it doesn't function like that anymore at some point, and that is I think you know. There's something to it, of course, that the portable Belarus exists outside of Belarus, and you can give it shape, and you can institutionalize it, organize it in certain ways, and it can be very powerful. But the danger of it is that it drifts away, of course, from the people at home, and then reconnecting it will become more difficult. That's one point. So time is crucial, and how the rest of the world develops is a crucial dimension of that. I've called Lukashenko a sort of uber opportunist in a way, you know, using the geopolitical situation as to his advantage as it is unfolding. And unfortunately, it's unfolding quite in his advantage, you have to say, at this point. So yeah, it's a very dangerous time, I think, in that respect. What else could I add to that story? I was just thinking something about the role of culture and so on. Here, I think, you know, what we've seen to some extent also with the fact that other things in the world are taking so much of our attention space right now, that it really becomes hard to keep the energy going, I think, within the Belarusian diaspora for some hope of democratic change. And maybe democratic change will not happen overnight, but will take some time, even, you know, if there is a post-Lukashenko phase when it arrives at some point. And maybe there are some prospects for some form of democracy. It will not overnight maybe turn into some ideal democracy or some better, you know, some place where all things are, or maybe marginally better, but not all things are solved. So that's also going to be a dangerous time then. So yeah, we can go on for a lot of time reflecting on this, but it's clear that there are many challenges ahead for Belarus and also for the Belarusian diaspora.
No, yes, indeed. And I wanted to ask something else. It's also a bit forward-looking, but in a bit different way. That in your book you actually give space to a lot of stories and many different aspects. People who spend time in prison, people in exile, people of different ages, people really of various groups, and also different professions, right? But there are also many stories that are missing, right? People who are still in prison and spend most of the time, people who are in Belarus. And I was wondering, if you were to write Polsslag 2.0, what would you add? Who would you add to that book?
Oh, that's a difficult question right now because I have to choose between so many stories, and I could enlist so many stories now. Yeah, I think, 2.0, I think, would not focus only on music, but on other creative forms. I've heard from people who have been in political prisoners who were now freed, but discovered during the time that poetry, for example, was a way of keeping, their spirit alive. And so poetry, it seems so innocent and so far from politics, but apparently it plays still a beautiful and important role in political mobilization, and in keeping, even if only that, keeping your minds sane in such a extraordinary, difficult situation. So I think, and the same stories could be told about visual art, about all kinds of other creative forms of keeping your mind sane. So I think I would still focus on art. I think it's so important to tell that story, but I think in the second version of the book, I would include a number of other stories, not only the musical story. And Katja, we can brainstorm and talk about all the other stories that need to be included in that second edition.
Thank you so much. I guess I will give the floor back to Alina if there are some questions that we still have some time, but no.
Thank you very much. It was really interesting. I would like to hear if we have any questions from the audience. Just turn on your micro and ask the question, or you can also write it down in the chat. But I have a lot of questions, so I just want to take over and use the rest of the time.
Yeah, I can also say that, if you would, people are going to maybe sometimes, see this later on when it's posted, not in real life, not now at this particular moment. So they can, I'm also happy to answer questions through email. I mean, happy to be contacted through social media or whatever. So yeah, that can also happen later on.
Please, Ksenia. You are still muted.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor, for your presentation, and Katerina for all your comments and really insightful questions, because you have this internal view, and your reading of the book is much more, so your vision is provided better understanding of the situation as well. So yeah, I want to ask about Перемен, the song that you started from, and the main pillar of your book as well. I see it as a universal anthem for a lot of post-Soviet countries that went through at least trials of protests. I'm originally from Russia, and if we're talking about anecdotes, I want to give you another one. That in Russia we are saying that if we all live in Netflix series, usually we talk about Belarus, that they are in the 5th season, and we are in Russia only in the 3rd one. So, and the matter of repressions, we always have a look on them, what is going on in Belarus. But at the same time, going back to this universal anthem, Pyramid, I'm really thinking of the imperialistic nature of it. It's still in Russian. It's still from Soviet period. Um, it was born in St. Petersburg, not in any other country that were part of Soviet Union.
In Leningrad.
Yes, in Leningrad for that moment. In your case study, maybe in your interviews, did you feel some reflection on it? Was it problematized by people that you talked with, or maybe you found some seeds of it in your analysis? So generally, how is it going on?
Yeah, so So what does a song mean? And it means something at a particular moment for someone, but it can change. And it can change from time to time and from place to place. And I think what is remarkable about, lots of the Kino songs is that they have different meaning for different people. And even for, I think, people who are pro-Kremlin, the Kino songs are sometimes used in political propaganda too. But when you talk specifically about the imperial aspect, or like the Soviet Empire kind of dimension of it, because it is a song that traveled through all the post-Soviet states, but was actually the product of the center, let's say, in the language of the center of the empire. Well, that meaning is there, and for some people it's an offensive song. And I think in Ukraine, for example, people would resent it for that reason. At the same time, the song can also be a little bit seen as saved from that imperialism, because in a way, it's also not the singer of the band, Viktor Tsoi, famously was also this kind of subversive, sort of hard to identify artist with Korean roots. So his father, from his father's side, he goes back to these the Soviet Koreans who were under Stalin moved, from the east to Kazakhstan. So basically, he's also sort of the victim of the history of ethnic manipulation of the Soviet Union. He doesn't go into that in his songs, and his songs are famously apolitical, which leave them very open for all kinds of interpretations. So at least in some versions of understanding that heritage, it's not so much the song representing the empire, but a song built on the remnants of that empire, also emblematic of what people had to experience during the history of that imperialism. And by accident, it came to life in Leningrad, but Leningrad in the 1980s was the place where there was a huge sort of underground rock culture, and it can be seen very much as part of that too. So yeah, so a bit of a convoluted way of answering your questions, but basically, I think that's what makes this song even more interesting, that it can mean so many things in so many different contexts. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Katsiarina, you have...
Yeah, I wanted to add to that. It's not a question, but on Permian, because I think one function that this indeed Russian-speaking song served is that it also created space for a more critical reflection on the Soviet past, the process that never ever took place in Belarus on the official level, right? Because a lot of the history is unknown, let's say. A lot of the important dates for the country's history are not celebrated. And I think this sort of song, it also pointed to maybe much deeper roots indeed of the reflection that still needs to take place, right, on the Soviet crimes, on Belarus' place in the Soviet Union, on all of that. And it never took place in the 90s, right, because Lukashenko came to power almost immediately. It was just a couple of years after the breakup of the Soviet Union. And I think to me, this is an aspect that is really important when we talk about the song like Peremian, right? But also others, because that's still the process that needs to take place. And I think here music and art a little bit creates this platform for this dialogue and discussion that I hope will take place in Belarus in the near future.
Yeah, it's a good point. Yeah.
It was exactly my first question. If just one from this particular song from the 80s is a kind of nexus with a missing transition in the 90s, that they are still some kind in this post-Soviet situation, but a kind of Soviet situation. According to the very close relations to Russia, even participating as a part of Russia in a way, how we can see it from some talks from Lukashenko, that offered Belarus as a kind of part of Russia. I think like 10 years ago there was a speech where I was talking to Putin, and he told that this connection should be like kind of, yeah, like, you know, part of Russian empire, still being there and still being a part of it. But that's what you said, that probably really is the point, that there was no transition, so they are still in this kind of missing this turning point in history that I think even in Russia took part in some situation. It was just taken back by yeah.
Yeah, that makes me think actually of the fact that we tend to see history as sort of a linear following of one episode after another. So there's a Soviet period, there's a post-Soviet period, there's, you know, dictatorship, democracy, and so on and so forth. But I think when you look at the post-Soviet zone or Eastern Europe, let's say, sometimes you know, periods don't follow each other logically. So you can have one period which could be called like the post-Soviet, you know, shadow, and it comes up and is very important, but then it's forgotten and something else takes place, but it can pop up again. So it's not always that there's a linearity, that one episode, you know, once it stops, it's over for good. And sometimes things need to be revisited and need to be re-experienced, or a discussion needs to be re-held from another perspective. You know, you could say the same thing about in, you know, Western Europe about colonial times. You know, every now and then the post-colonial debate pops up, and it's different versions of that each time. And each time it's worthwhile to have that discussion because it changes our views of the past, refines it, but also changes our interpretations of the current times a bit. So I think there's a lot of that going on in Eastern Europe too.
But I still think that it, you know, there's a lot of songs, as you said. Also, the Mury were popular in Belarus. That's why I just keep thinking, if there is the song you are choosing, if there is a particular cultural and mnemonic way of thinking of this song, not the other one, you know, or writing just a new song, if there are still connections, why this particular song is working in this situation.
Is that a question? Well, yes.
Yes, it's a question. Yeah. It's because I was thinking a little bit like, you know, like Alvax thinking about the construction of the memory or in the particular cultural groups and the particular times, and there's kind of different components of this memory of so how it works, if there is a special way why some songs are working at this particular point of time and others are not.
It's a difficult question, obviously. I mean, I think it might be something in the music that catches on, or some lyric or something that really, you know, makes a song suddenly more emblematic. But that essentialism, I would be careful of it. It's also the contexts in which it has been used and which you know, accumulates or in which it accumulates certain meanings. What you see with the Permien song, it's accumulated a lot of meaning, extra layers of meaning in 2020, let's say. And other songs are sometimes referring to that song. So it becomes like a cultural key to tell more than one thing. But there's no formula, I think. It's not like you can invent today a song and then know for sure that it's going to perform that function. It's a bit of a coincidence of history, which song exactly, you know, starts to resonate in such a way.
But I think that you can create and decide which song. And I think that you can decide it, it happens. But why it happens, what is the meaning connected to the song. We have there was a song, I don't know the name of it, in Germany, written during the Second World War. It was written by the opposition, so the underground, the German underground was not so big, and it was completely forgotten in Western Germany. It was used in Eastern Germany, and now it's have like, you know, this connection as a communist song, even though it wasn't. So I think about this way to thinking what connection to the past kind of song has, and why you are choosing or going for this song. It's like choosing is like, you know, choice, like a process of choosing. So like, why this one and not the other one? Is this more this connection, like, you know, also could be more, because as you said, it was also popular, but is this a kind of connection to the Russian identity? Not like we're supporting Russian, but it's more like, you know, there is still more this concept of being connected to Russia than being connected to Poland, you know, and it's for somehow you're using this song because it has more like substance for the society than kind of Polish song because of the situation, and you know.
Yeah, I see that Katja has a comment on that, or a reflection.
No, just yeah, I wanted to add on this that I mean, I fully agree. It's always random, I think, what becomes popular, but I believe that there is an important process also taking place here, and this is the process of reappropriation of some symbols and songs and memories. I will give just one example, also what you, Peter, studied national symbols, right? And for example, the white, red, white flag that is now widely used by the Belarusian opposition, and that kind of dates back in its history to the Belarusian People's Republic and has this long history. For how many people is it the flag of the Belarusian People's Republic, right? And this is a bit my point, that for how many people is Peremen a Soviet anthem rather than something that resonated with that, right? So I think there is this process of really reappropriation of those memories, rethinking, and this is extremely interesting, right? Because these old symbols come back, but with a totally new meaning for many people, right? And that's extremely interesting.
Yeah. That's why what I'm thinking is it's so interesting for me, because I'm also making my research and business in the transition, and we have this rollback in, for example, in Poland, and you can also see that we have this punk band Deserta. It was established in the 70s, and it was progressive against the socialist regime, and it's still progressive. And then they are attacked by the post-oppositionals. They are turned right-wing. So the band didn't change much. It's still progressive band, but the public that loved it during the fighting against socialism hates them because now they are too leftist, and they are not fighting for the same reason. So I think that this is interesting how how those things can be translated or understood in the different historical situations, because otherwise it's important, because some symbols can start kind of process that we don't really want to have. What we can see in a lot of Central European and also Western European countries, that we are going to the symbols that are not so they are not belonging to a really glorious times in Europe. So I think
yeah. So there's a lot of this interpretation, reinterpretation, reappropriation, and so on. Maybe I can add just one more note on the creation of a political song. I think the most powerful, as artistic products, the most powerful political songs are very often songs that are not political at the basis, or not political in their sloganism, because very often if they're slogan-esque songs, they disappear very quickly and they're dismissed as propaganda. But if you have an ambiguous song, or a song that, you know, ostensibly doesn't have to do anything with politics, it can be very, you know, more easily become a powerful political product, a political work of art. So that's intriguing to see that happen, how it, you know, from a love song it becomes a protest song, and so on. Very often the songs that I'm interested in, the music that I'm interested in, is not so much the songs that are being deliberately written as, you know, having a political message, but someone somehow acquire it across the you know, the history, let's say, across the events that are happening around it.
Yeah.
Maybe I have one more remark, if it's possible. I see that
Yes,
we
yes,
have
yes.
time. I really like that Katerina mentioned that that real politics in authoritarian regimes quite often happen on the kitchen, and it made me reflect on the, you know, this transition, that music was taken from the kitchens and moved to the streets. And this dynamic and this transition from private to public nexus is really interesting, because most of these songs previously before protest are usually a part of, you know, this home culture processes, singing with the guitar with the friends during, I don't know, in a karaoke or somewhere else. And then in the moment of this political explosion, I don't know. Yeah, they move to the streets, and that's interesting. Which songs are move, which songs are still kept in the private dimension, and maybe to make a bridge to this music of exile, that most of this music now are living abroad, but it doesn't mean that it's not consuming inside the country. It doesn't mean that this music is still a part of this kitchen politics. That's what I want to mention. And it's interesting, you know, to maybe follow biographies of the songs, how they are living now in Belarus in the current environment. I don't have a question. That's just a reflection. Maybe you have
Reflection.
something to answer.
Thank you for that. Yeah.
So if we hand off, I would have many questions, but I think maybe we'll really talk some time. Oh, hello. Hi. And
Solo mom,
but
as I said.
I would say thank you for being here. Thank you for presenting your book. Thank you for making comments to the book, Katerina. Thank you for presenting your book, Peter. And yes, I hope we will see each other in maybe in conference, or maybe we'll have the possibility to talk about the songs and the music and the once more. It would be really interesting for me.
Very good.
Thank you
I
very
hope
much.
so. It was very nice talking to you, and I hope some viewers will join on YouTube later on. So, and like I said, I'm always happy to be in touch with anyone who's interested in the topic.
Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.